This episode of Yesterworld is sponsored by NordVPN. Stay to the end of the video to learn why I personally use them to protect my internet experience, and save 66% off a 2-year plan by using code Yesterworld at nordvpn.com/Yesterworld. When it comes to attractions surrounded in mystery and urban legends, Disneyland's Haunted Mansion is at the top of the list. Since debuting in 1969, the ride has changed in many ways, and its history contains many abandoned effects. So let's explore the evolution of one of Disney's most iconic and spooky attractions. A few years after the opening of Disneyland, visitors could buy special, large-format park souvenir maps, and the first 1958 version is special for a number of reasons. For one, it showcased a number of upcoming attractions that ultimately never came to be. It also had the first glimpse of the upcoming expansion and signature attractions of New Orleans Square, a walk-through wax museum that of course eventually became Pirates of the Caribbean, and a haunted house.
And Mark Davis is the master in charge of our House of Illusions, or what do we call it?
A haunted mansion.
Haunted mansion and supernatural.
Now, since there are many great videos out there that explore the history of the Haunted Mansion's development in depth, here we're just going to hit some of the bullet points leading up to its debut, especially since we'll be coming back to a few of them when exploring the attraction's evolution. In 1961, this haunted house was officially announced as the Haunted Mansion, with a planned opening of 1963. The exterior was constructed and finished by the promised date, but the attraction itself was put on hold due to Walt Disney's involvement in the New York World's Fair, which must have seemed pretty confusing to unaware guests looking at the empty attraction.
You've seen this many times, but we haven't got the ghosts in there yet. But we're out collecting the ghosts.
Work resumed a couple years later and would now include many of the innovations made for attractions like Carousel of Progress and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. And though a restaurant companion similar to Pirates of the Caribbean's Blue Bayou had been developed, this was ultimately scrapped.
A house of illusion, what do we call it?
Museum of the Weird.
Museum of the Weird.
Even by 1966, the only indication that the attraction was still coming was a sign out front of the mansion. But finally, in March of 1969, the Haunted Mansion was officially announced for a grand opening that fall. Unsurprisingly, there was a lot of hype leading up to its debut, and when the Haunted Mansion finally opened, it drew in an astounding amount of visitors. Upon entering the attraction and passing through the long-closed iron gates, the queue passed by the outside of the mansion's entrance and into a graveyard. Originally, this section was to be a separate walkthrough, and as can be seen, it was actually included in the mansion's construction, and remained as late as 1968. But later, foreseeing the need for a longer queue to accommodate guests, it was transformed into just part of the line. Entering the mansion, you found yourself in the foyer, and it's here where the first of the many ravens throughout the attraction would have been located, but it was either never installed or removed before opening day. Inside the stretching room, the original portraits were heavily inspired by Mark Davis's concept art, and the walls were initially lined with blue stripes. I only mention this because a lot of people assume that Disneyland's Haunted Mansion only ever had its iconic red stripe pattern. The original portrait hallway was simplistic but very effective, and gave visitors a great build-up of the experience to come, but this was originally intended to be much more elaborate. Back when the Haunted Mansion was being designed as a walkthrough attraction, each group of visitors would stop in front of the 5 portraits in the hall. Right before their eyes, they'd see each portrait transform into 4 to 6 different stages, either all at once or in a domino effect. One thing I never personally realized myself was just how many concepts were developed but ultimately went unused. Though each portrait was designed for this transformation effect, once the attraction was redesigned for the Omnimover vehicle system, the section just became part of the queue. In fact, the only reason there are 2 stretching rooms/elevators in the first place is because when the Haunted Mansion was being planned as a walkthrough, it was to have 2 identical show buildings. However, by the time the walkthrough element was scrapped, the stretching rooms had already been completed.
This is the endless hallway. A misty passage beckoning you to enter, but offering no end.
Once in the loading area, doom buggies descended from a hill and through a giant spiderweb, and once on board, you'd first arrive at the endless hallway. Interestingly, up until maybe a year or so of the mansion's debut, the scene was to be much more complex, parts of which were installed and still remain today. As planned, suddenly you'd feel actual chills and see the window curtain flutter to your left and hear footsteps approaching from the hall, getting closer and closer and closer. As the spirit approached, it brushed by the night, causing its hand to move, and the ghost seemingly passed straight through you. The effect continued in the conservatory with a billow of smoke, hinting the arrival of this new ghostly presence. The chills aspect was achieved by an air conditioning unit that quickly blew out freezing air, and another that acted as a vacuum and sucked it back up. The sound of a ghost walking from the halls and through you was achieved by a series of hidden speakers. They began in the hall and continued directly overhead and behind the doom buggy. Traces of the sequence remain to this day and can even be found in the Story and Song album. But while some reports suggest the chills aspect might have been present early on, it's believed the rest of the effect sequence was abandoned long before officially opening. After passing through the conservatory, it was easy to see just how many elements were borrowed from the 1963 movie The Haunting, including the previous endless hallway, and the photos on the wall teased at the ghost to come. You then came to the seance room, where Madame Leota's head could be seen inside a crystal ball. As initially planned, you would have actually seen her face upon entering the room, with the cabinet hiding the projector, and while this was of course revised, the cabinet remained. Curiously, of all the objects floating in the air, one was to be a certain candelabra that was eventually relocated to the endless hallway. Another effect was a fluorescent painted ghost on silk that was blown with a fan to make it seem more ghost-like. The ballroom was one of the attraction's most impressive show scenes, but required a last-minute change when Imagineers realized they had a problem. For those unaware, the scene was achieved by an effect called Pepper's Ghost, and what guests see is a reflection of the actual figures below. The ballroom was to have 6 dancing couples, but in reality there were initially only 3 couples that were multiplied with a series of mirrors. The problem was that the effect only worked at a direct angle and was lost at any other. So an additional 3 couples on a turntable were quickly added.
Look, you can see right through the dancers.
From here we enter the attic, which is by far the most different from how it appears today. Ghosts popped out of a series of hat boxes with a terrifying scream, some of which were based on the ones you saw in the hallway. Others had more of a ghoulish appearance that were initially designed as more realistic skeleton heads. There was also an effect where strings hung from the ceiling and brushed against your face, simulating going through cobwebs. With the appearance of bats circling above in the distance, the corpse bride came into view. Now you've probably seen this picture floating around claiming to be the first version of the bride, however it's believed to only be a prototype. The first incarnation took on a very terrifying corpsey appearance, with glowing eyes and a beating heart. This is believed to have been directly inspired by Mark Davis's unused concept art for one of the transforming portraits. To give the scene a more haunted and misty appearance, she was placed behind large plastic sheets that stretched from the floor to the ceiling, but this lasted a very short time. Approaching the attic's exit, the infamous Hatbox Ghost came into view on the right side of the vehicle. Now, if you want a detailed history of this iconic and mysterious figure, I highly recommend heading over to Dan Olson's incredible Haunted Mansion blog, doombuggies.com, or hey, just check out one of my earliest videos exploring the subject. Regardless, we'll be getting back to this in a bit. But here's a quick fun fact. While the promo photographs with Yale Gracie and the Hatbox Ghost were just prototypes, the actual Hatbox Ghost can be seen in the Osmond special before it was installed.
They all seem to be in good order and capable of taking care of themselves. Although some needed a hand.
Making your way to the graveyard, you passed a scared, partially bearded caretaker with reddish hair and his dog. In the mansion's early years, the graveyard sequence was more closely tied to the soundtrack, as the pop-up ghosts were synchronized with the music to deliver a scream or wail at the end of each line. The attraction ended with the hitchhiking ghosts, and while they usually appeared inside your vehicle, there was another effect that occasionally took place instead, and those who have witnessed it described it as wispy wraith-like ghosts that floated around the vehicle in the mirror. It's believed this effect was used in case of mechanical failure for the main illusion, or installed when Imagineers weren't sure if the intended effect would be finished in time.
Want to go again, Mr. Gridley? No, thank you.
So that's the original 1969 version of the Haunted Mansion. So let's go over a few of the changes that occurred just weeks after first debuting. The first change is rather curious, as according to Imagineer X Atencio, the web string effect was removed within a matter of days after the attraction's opening. That said, I have a confession to make. In my Snow White Evolution video, I may have missed a particular effect. As can be seen here in the original layout, the same string effect was used near the cobweb in the Witch's Dungeon. It's been bothering me for weeks, so I just wanted to get that in here. Another rather immediate change also occurred in the attic. While the effect of the Hatbox Ghost worked well in controlled environments, once installed, the ambient lighting in the attic was problematic. The figure was uninstalled for maintenance and reinstalled a number of times in the weeks after the attraction's debut. However, the effect never worked as intended, so he was permanently removed. Without any sort of climax to the attic scene, the bride was relocated from her original position to where the Hatbox Ghost resided. We know for sure the changes took place within the first few months of opening, as evidenced by the Osmond TV special filmed in January of 1970. Outside the attraction, the first major change came around May of 1970, when the graveyard was removed entirely in favor of expanding the queue, and the tombstones were moved to a berm sometime later. Inside the attraction, the most noticeable difference came when the white china in the ballroom was replaced by blue designs in the mid-70s to 80s. Oh, I'm totally kidding. Beginning around 1972, the portraits in the stretching room would see the first of many redesigns of the paintings. This was due to them being hand-painted and slightly reimagined by different anonymous artists each time a new set was needed from wear and tear. In the gallery, the portraits were reworked to include some of the other stages of the transformation. Another major change happened in the attic in the late 70s, when the bride was given a complete makeover. In this version, she appeared very similar to the original prototype. Now in 1974, there was an incident worth mentioning as traces still exist today. According to a member of the park's security team, one day 22 caliber bullet holes were found in a window near the end of the Primeval diorama, and snowflakes in Adventure Through Inner Space. And while they were quickly covered up by a spider prop, they were also found in the Haunted Mansion, with a hole in one of the giant panes of glass and another beneath the duelist on the other side of the room, though many debate as to whether the roof would or wouldn't have to be removed in order to replace the glass. Sources claim there's actually a spare hidden behind the wild wall near the fireplace, but as it's the only spare with the exact dimensions, it wasn't deemed worth using given how easily the hole could be covered up. Another interesting change was sometime in the early 80s, when the pop-up ghosts that were synchronized with the ride's audio track were muted. In the summer of 1985, Disney began testing a new element for the Haunted Mansion: live actors.
In one hallway where we have some suits of armor, your car turns around and something reaches out and touches you. And as your car turns, one of the knights is alive, and a large hatchet, an executioner's hatchet, comes down toward the car. We may populate the Haunted Mansion with 3 or 4 live ghosts, if you will, that will do that.
As you can imagine, this didn't bode well with families, so the axe was removed from his or her attire and the knights were forbidden from touching the guests. Eventually, due to the unpredictable behavior of the frightened visitors, the cast member was given a remote to shut down the ride. Of course, this led to a lot of unnecessary downtime, so the whole idea was scrapped by the end of the summer. The early 90s saw a new addition to the mansion's exterior, a white hearse with an invisible horse. But as Disney Dan already covered this in a previous collaboration of ours, I'm just gonna let that roll.
While planning for the unrealized Indiana Jones stunt show for Disneyland in the 90s, a large white hearse was purchased for use during one of the stunts. When the show was ultimately replaced with the now famous Indiana Jones thrill ride, Imagineers were left in possession of this large white hearse with nowhere to put it. It was suggested that the prop be put in the queue for the Haunted Mansion, and Tony Baxter cleverly came up with the idea to add an invisible horse hitch onto the front. Nearly 30 years prior to its purchase, it was featured in a John Wayne film called The Sons of Katie Elder. This hearse is seen twice in the film, first for the funeral and then later in the movie during a scene with The Undertaker.
Thanks, Disney Dan. Please don't sue me.
That's okay, Chipper. You can tell me all about it.
The mid-90s came another redesign of the bride, but this one was far less menacing and more heartbroken, but this also depended entirely on the lighting. To amp up the whole wedding theme, pop-up heads were dressed as groomsmen shouting, "I do," and a ghost piano player was also added playing a haunting version of the iconic wedding march.
I do.
However, this version of the Bride would see a number of alterations over the years, with Imagineers playing around with the veil and glowing eyes. Of course, by far the biggest change to the Haunted Mansion in its entire history was the introduction of Haunted Mansion Holiday in 2001.
Come see what it's like when holidays collide in the Haunted Mansion Holiday at Disneyland Park.
Haunted Mansion Holiday wasn't just a simple makeover, it was a massive overhaul both inside the mansion and out. Once Haunted Mansion Holiday was over and the attraction returned to its former self, fans noticed something was missing. The graveyard that once resided in the berm was nowhere to be seen. Over the years, the tombstones had begun to disappear one by one, leaving only 5 of the original 13 by 1999, and as later explained by Disney, they were removed for the holiday overlay and then they were unable to find them. Inside the Haunted Mansion, much like the tombstones, the giant spiderweb in the loading area was now missing, as well as the ghost in the seance room, neither of which would ever return. A number of other changes occurred within the mansion during the early to mid-2000s, many of which were simple updates. In honor of Disney's 50th anniversary, Madame Leota was given a floating effect and ghostly specters. However, one of the most drastic changes came in 2006, when the attic scene underwent a major retheming and saw the removal of the pop-up ghosts and fluttering bats. In their place were portraits of a bride and groom that transformed into the groom being beheaded. In a very controversial decision, the bride was replaced by a new character in the form of a digital projection, Constance Hatchaway. Get it? Hatchaway? I'll see myself out. 2015 saw another major change but was far more welcome, the return of the Hatbox Ghost. Kind of. The next year saw the return of the graveyard, faithfully recreating the originals while adding a few new ones as well. As for the next big change to the original Haunted Mansion, we'll have to wait and see. But let me know in the comments below if you would or wouldn't want to see the original hitchhiking ghosts become their CGI Magic Kingdom counterpart. I've always found it interesting that Imagineer Claude Coates wanted to make the Haunted Mansion much darker and truly scary. Ultimately, they settled for a more lighthearted approach. But what is scary is having your passwords, banking information, or identity stolen when using unsecured public Wi-Fi. All jokes aside, now more than ever, we're at a constant risk of having our personal information stolen, especially when using public Wi-Fi. But with a VPN service like NordVPN, you don't have to worry about that because all of the data sent from your laptop, cell phone, or tablet is encrypted. They offer military-grade protection, thousands of high-speed servers in 61 countries and counting, and it's the only VPN service to receive a perfect score from PC Magazine. Personally, I used to use another VPN service, but once I tried NordVPN, I decided to permanently make the switch. And one of my favorite aspects of the service is the very intuitive and easy-to-use app. As a special offer to my viewers, use code Yesterworld at nordvpn.com/Yesterworld to save 66% off a 2-year plan. So head over to nordvpn.com to start protecting yourself today. I wanted to give a special thanks to Dan Olson at the Long Forgotten Haunted Mansions blog and doombuggies.com for helping me with the research and some of the assets for this video. My voice is about gone, so as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Yesterworld.